Good evening and welcome to our next lesson in our Fulton Bible Institute series. We appreciate you for joining us this semester as we have went through the Old Testament. We are continuing to look at these Old Testament books. We continue to be in the major prophets. Today we'll continue looking at, we'll look at our next major prophet, Ezekiel. We're halfway through the major prophets. As a matter of fact, we're halfway through this quarter. We've got, I think, 5 more lessons. We're only the goal is, if we can fit them in a time, that we're going to do one more major prophet of Daniel. Then when we start doing the minor prophets, we're actually going to break them up into groups of 3. We're going to stay 3 minor prophets at a time, and so that'll take 4 more lessons. So we've got 5 more lessons left. Now, again, I appreciate everyone bearing with us and working with us this year. That is different and totally different than usual. But so far, we've received a good word, so we're glad that you're liking this and glad that you are being able to watch these. One quick thing I want to mention, if you could help us out with this, and we'll try to start mentioning this in all of our videos, is if you could leave us a like on Facebook or a like on YouTube or share us on Facebook so that we can get these videos out and you can get more popular. Also, if you watch us on YouTube, if you could click that subscribe button on the bottom and subscribe to our videos, you'll be told every time the Fulton Church Cross puts a video out, which we put out a couple videos a week for our classes. But the main thing that would be is that will help us build our base and hopefully be able to spread out the word more. So I should have been talking about this in our previous videos, but we just have neglected to do that. But if you could help us out with that help us out in that endeavor, we'd greatly appreciate it and greatly help us to, again, be able to do more things with this videos and be able to do more than what we're doing now. But anyway, that's the beginning. That's the introduction. Let's get into the study of Ezekiel. Remember the timing of Ezekiel. Ezekiel, as we mentioned last week, was a contemporary of Jeremiah. We are talking about what happens after the fall of Jerusalem. Our last 2 major prophets are going to be written during the time of Babylonian captivity. Daniel's going to cover from the captivity all the way into the fall of Babylon. He's going to record for 70 years of the Babylonian captivity. However, Ezekiel's not going to cover as much of a period. He's just going to be sitting there in the or what happens in the Babylonian captivity. So let's talk about this before we get too much and I get ahead of myself here. As we look at Ezekiel, we can see that Ezekiel, again, is writing to the people, writing for the people here in Babylon. And Ezekiel is their fellow captive. He's their fellow captive. When we look at Daniel, remember Daniel, we'll say this next week, when Daniel was taken into captivity, Daniel was taken into Babylon to where Nebuchadnezzar was, and he was put into the palace, and he was trained to be a courier, a court wise man for Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar puts him in a very high position. Daniel has a position where he was in the kingdom, in the palace. Ezekiel, however, is not. Ezekiel is actually with the people. He is one of the fellow captives that's with everyone else. He writes there at the same time. So basically what you have here is you have a very unique view of this time period. Because you have Jeremiah who's writing from Egypt. When the captivity happens, Jeremiah is eventually taken to Egypt to get away from the captivity, again, against his will. And we talked about that last week. Then you have Ezekiel and Daniel writing from Babylon, but Daniel writes from the palace. Ezekiel writes from the shores of the Chebar Canal, right with the people. And so this is what we see here with Ezekiel. And so you get these 3 different viewpoints. And again, Jeremiah begins before the captivity and covers the first part of it. Ezekiel is going to focus on the captivity of what God has called him. We're going to see when God called him in the time period of that. And then we're going to see Daniel sort of covers, again, that time period of the Babylonian captivity, but also into the reign of Persia. So that's the time frames of what we're looking at in these 3 books and how they sort of line up and how they have some similarities. The book is autobiographical in tone with the first person singular employed throughout. Throughout the book of Ezekiel, Ezekiel referred to himself as I saw this, I heard this, I did this. And so it has this very personal tone to it. He writes in a first person viewpoint. And so this is one of the characteristics about this great book. Wrong way. Excuse me. His work began in the 5th year of his exile. Ezekiel begins to prophesy 5 years into the Babylonian captivity, and he prophesies for nearly 20 years. And again, he was the voice of God to the exiles in Babylon. He is the one who speaks to the people. He is the one who speaks to these people who are hearing him and to these people that are in the captivity. I don't remember if it talks about here. Let me slip ahead. Yeah, we're going to talk about when he's called. His age, excuse me. I forget exactly the order of these notes. Ezekiel is also, about his history, we talked last week, Jeremiah is one we know the most about. We know a good bit about Ezekiel too. Ezekiel was a member of the priestly family. So here you have Daniel is apparently the royal family, a noble. That's the reason why he's carried into the palace. And now you have a priest, a priestly family, a Levite, who, again, would have some familiarity. And you'll see that come through in this book because you're going to see that Ezekiel has a concern for the temple and the priesthood. And so he has this concern throughout his book. You can see in Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 3, but also in Ezekiel 40, he's going to talk about the new temple, and he's going to talk about the measurements of that temple. And this is why he talks about that, because that's very close to him, because he was a prophet, or he was not just a prophet, he was a priest. And so he was a Levitical family. So again, this is again another interesting thing. You have this guy whose life was about the temple and serving in the temple, who's now been taken away from that temple and the service of his God and has been moved to a foreign country. And now he's living in that foreign land away from all that he's known for his entire life. He was carried into Babylon at a young age. Ezekiel 1:1 tells us that he was about 30 years old when he began to function as a prophet. So he's 30 when God calls him, and God tells him to start preaching. Now, what we find out is that this is what I said a minute ago. If you go back here, that his work begins in the 5th year of his exile. So Ezekiel, if he's 30 when he starts prophesying, he prophesies after being in Babylon for 5 years. That means Ezekiel was captured or taken captive at around the age of 25. So Ezekiel was a relatively young man when this happened, and so he would have been deported from Judah. And again, of those deportations, he is of the second group. Now, if you know your history, you know Nebuchadnezzar comes 3 times, or Babylon comes 3 times. The first time they come in, they capture Jerusalem, they capture Judah, make it into a vassal kingdom. This is when they take away Daniel. They take away the nobles. They take away some of the higher ups so they can bring them into Babylon, and they basically bring them in to train them to be foreign ministers so they can help the people and assist in these people they've captured, and they can learn the ins and out of the Babylonian lifestyle, and then they can be the representatives for Babylon to these other nations. Well, about 10 years later, I believe it is, there's a second batch that comes through. In this second batch, there's about 10,000 people that are taken to Babylon. And in this second batch is when Ezekiel comes, and Ezekiel's carried away. And they are taken away to a city or village called Tel Abib. Tel Abib is and this is on the river Chebar. This is a river that was in Babylon, right outside of Babylon. It was also a canal that was man-made to help with the water that's needed in that area. Again, modern day, we're talking modern day Iran, Iraq area. So it's very dry. And so this was needed. And so they would be by the river. Now, this is also important, and this is a little side note that doesn't really apply to Ezekiel. But this is where you see in the New Testament, you remember when Paul goes into, I think it's Philippi, when he goes in, he finds finds Lydia, the seller of purple. And he stays at her house and all that. Remember, he finds them on the riverside praying and having, on the Sabbath, they were on the riverside praying. Well, that started here. That started in the exile because they were by the river. And so what they would do is, because they couldn't go to the temple to worship, couldn't go to the temple to serve God, they would go by the riverside, and they would get there, they would turn toward Jerusalem, and they would do their service to God there. Ezekiel has many visions and dramatic deeds, and therefore they make this book very vivid. Ezekiel's a very vivid book, a very book that a lot of people will take and run with. because of its vivid images. And Ezekiel has very vivid images. I've heard people talk about that. We're going to talk about some of it if I remember at the right time. There's points where some people would say that this book prophesies about Russia and talks about a coming war, or a coming world war that's going to involve the whole world. There's also people who take Ezekiel, I believe it's 1 or 2, and talk about the wheels, and they're going to talk about that's UFOs, and there's aliens in the world. And it's amazing what people will come up with, but some of that comes from Ezekiel, and it becomes out of his very vivid, very dramatic visions and what we're told about. So we look at all that to see what this prophet was about. This prophet has a message to his people that calamity had come upon Judah as a punishment for sin. And this is something the people didn't like. They didn't like being told that they were being punished. They didn't like to be told that Jerusalem, God's city, failed because they were sinful, because they were wrong. And that put them in a terrible spot, put them in a bad position. They didn't want to be told that they had sinned, that their sin had caused their great city to fall. And so, just like Isaiah, Ezekiel can be divided into 2 parts. The first 32 chapters are a gloomy passages about judgment. They're very much about what God is going to do, what God has done to the people. And again, it's not just what he's done to Jerusalem, but also done to Jerusalem and Judah, but also to surrounding nations. And then in chapter 33 and following, we see from 33 to 48, we see the promises of future glory, the promises of what's coming later. The promises, again, that although God has brought punishment, God's not through with Israel. God's not leaving them high and dry. God's got a plan for them beyond this. And so what we see is that Ezekiel begins his work. And when Ezekiel began his work, I forget the exact dates, but Ezekiel began his work in the captivity in 5 years after being taken in second captivity. And again, there's 10 or 15 years between each captivity. And this is before Ezekiel begins before the third group taken into captivity, the biggest group. And this is in the third captivity when Nebuchadnezzar comes down. He comes out of the north and he lays Jerusalem flat. He tears Jerusalem down. He tears the temple down. He levels everything inside. And so what happens is Ezekiel begins these prophecies by prophesying about what's going to happen, that this is a punishment from God that's going to be there for a while. Again, Jeremiah says 70 years, and Ezekiel gives an idea that it was a temporary captivity, but it was going to be longer than what some of the people were expecting. And what happens is that the other false prophets, the false prophets of Israel, were saying, oh, don't listen to Ezekiel. Don't listen to what he says. Now, he doesn't know anything he's talking about. This captivity is going to be short. This captivity is going to be brief. We know that because Jerusalem has not fallen. Jerusalem has not been destroyed. Jerusalem still stands. Therefore, God's still there. This is only a temporary minor setback. Well, that lasts until Jerusalem falls. Now, what's interesting about the book of Ezekiel is that typically what we see is those first 32 chapters, that gloomy prophecies, they happen before Jerusalem falls. And then after Jerusalem falls is when he begins to give the passages of hope, that glorious future. Well, why? Because until Jerusalem fell, there was a hope of these people that the false prophets were right. There was a hope that they would return home. They could go back to their normal lives. They could go back. Sure, there'd be a little difficulty, but they could go back and start back the way they were before, and everything would be fine. But when Jerusalem fell, when the city is leveled, when the temple is destroyed, they realized that wasn't the case. That they realize that, hey, everything's changed. And this causes the people, again, as typical, to reevaluate everything, to have some doubt and have some wonder about what's really going to happen. And so this is what we see in the great book of Ezekiel. Now, we talk about these. We're going to divide these again, these ideas into 2 halves, the prophecies before the fall and after the fall. Again, these are prophecies that fall in that time between the second and third captivity. And when I say the captivity, I don't mean that they're captive multiple times, but the trips of Nebuchadnezzar before his third and final trip, before his third trip to go gather up the most people, bring most of them back to Babylon. In chapter 1, verses 1 through chapter 3, verse 27, we get the introduction to this great book. And Ezekiel tells of seeing the glory of the Lord. He talks about in chapter 1, seeing the glory of God, and glory is there. And in this first 3 chapters of this great book, and in speaking of that, he talks about what God calls him to do. And God calls Ezekiel to come do a very special thing. God calls him to be a watchman, to the house of Israel. Now, we talked about this. This is a very interesting idea that we see here. What this watchman is, this watchman would have been very key, very vital in the ancient world. A watchman was a man who stood on the wall of a city, and he watched for people coming in. He would be a man who stood on the wall or stood in the gap of the wall. If the wall had been fallen, he would be watching that hole. And what this watchman's whole job was to be on guard. And this watchman had a mission to proclaim or to call out any warning. And this is what God tells Ezekiel. God tells Ezekiel, look, the people have their choice. The people have a choice to obey or not to obey. He says, but your job is to call them. Your job is to warn them. Your job is to tell them what's going wrong, that they need to change. And that's what Ezekiel takes on. Ezekiel becomes the watchman, and he calls Israel for their shortcoming. He calls Israel to change their lives, to go back to him, but they refuse to listen. They refuse to obey, and so that falls not on Ezekiel but on the people. And it's a very interesting description there of the watchman that God calls Ezekiel to be. Then chapter 4 and chapter 5 talks about through symbolic actions the fate of Jerusalem. God has Ezekiel do some certain things. He does certain things to demonstrate the fate of Jerusalem, how Jerusalem's going to fall, how Jerusalem's going to be destroyed. And again, this is before Jerusalem falls, that he predicts this is coming, and the people refuse to listen to it. And then in 6 and 7, he again gives 2 more oracles, 2 more sermons, 2 more statements about what's going to happen, about Jerusalem going to fall away or is going to be destroyed. And again, it's not happening, so the people doubt him. The people question him. And again, you can understand that if we were to talk about America falling, and I were to stand out here at Walmart, and I were to proclaim to the people coming in at Walmart, be wary, watch out, our nation's going to fall, our Washington, D.C. is going to be flattened, it's going to be removed. And again, I'm not a prophet, not going to say anything about that. No, I'm not implying anything, but just say I was saying that message, and I was say that, how many people would listen to me? How many people say, oh, well, no, we know Washington's still there. We see it every day on the news. We've not heard any news of that. You're crazy. You're crazy. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. But then when it happens, what are the people going to do? They're going to change their mind. And this is where Ezekiel's at. Ezekiel is warning about Jerusalem falling. And again, chapter 8 through chapter 11 speaks of the 6th year of his captivity. Now, 1 year in his being a prophet, he's given a vision from God of Jerusalem and its impending devastation. Again, Nebuchadnezzar's going to come in and not only going to knock a hole in the wall. He's already done that. And again, think about Nebuchadnezzar. He knocked a hole in the wall, and part of his command was they weren't to repair the wall. They weren't going to try. He wasn't going to allow them to fix the wall where they could stand against him. And so what Nebuchadnezzar is going to do the 3rd time, he's going to come in through that wall again, and then he's going to take every house in that city and level it. He's going to level the wall. He's going to destroy the temple and take everything out of it. He's going to make it where this great city is flat. And this is what we see later in the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, when they have to come back and rebuild everything. You know, in Nehemiah, we talked about that last quarter, about Nehemiah having to rebuild the wall and trying to rebuild the city of Jerusalem where it was functioning again. Well, he has to do that because Nebuchadnezzar wiped it out. Nebuchadnezzar come in and completely destroy the city, and he marched on and went on his happy way because Jerusalem fought against him. And it wasn't just Jerusalem he did this to, it was many places. But for us, in the Bible story, Jerusalem is the key place that he does this to. And so Ezekiel warns about what's going to happen, and then he tells why it's going to happen. In chapter 12, 13, and 14, he talks about this is going to happen because of these reasons. And listen to what he says. Chapter 12, he talks about Jerusalem's unbelief because of their unwillingness, their disbelief in God to change their life and change their behavior, to be the people God had called them to be. They're going to face this terrible consequences. They're going to face this destruction of their beloved city, the city where God's house is at. Now, and in chapter 13, he's going to say it's because they listen to the false prophets. They listen to the false prophets rather than the prophets of God. And these prophets are Jeremiah. These prophets are Ezekiel. These prophets are others that have prophesied of Isaiah and others we've not talked about, even some we don't know about. They refuse to listen to these prophets who prophesied for God and listen to the false prophets. Well, why? Just like today, people follow the false prophets because typically the false prophet didn't call them to change, didn't call them to rearrange their life, didn't call them to make their life right. They just say, keep doing what you're doing. What you're doing is great. God's blessing you. God's taking care of you. You've got this great city. Everything is fine. And then when something bad happens, it's just temporary. It's just temporary. Where God is saying, no, it's not temporary. It's going to be for 70 years. It's not going to be a long time, but it's going to be a shorter time. But it's going to be for 70 years, and that's a couple of generations. And so the people are refusing to listen to the prophets of God because they say bad things. They're prophesying truth, and the people don't want to hear it. And then finally in chapter 14, we're told that Ezekiel tells them that this is happening because they've turned away from God. They're turning toward idolatry. And we see this throughout the kings of how Israel fell further, Judah fell further and further and further away. Israel the same way. They let these false gods come in, let these false priests come in, these other religions come in and dilute their image of God, dilute their belief in God. And it brings them and causes them to fall further and further and further and further and further away from God. And because of their turning away from God and not coming back to Him, because they didn't obey that covenant that they established with God back in Exodus, they have to suffer. These bad things are happening to them. And so this is why Ezekiel is writing this great book, to tell them about what and why this is coming about. Chapter 15 through chapter 17, he's going to show them that punishment was necessary. That people had to be punished. They didn't obey, they didn't listen, they didn't turn to God, and they had to therefore be punished. But yet chapter 18 is a very beautiful picture in that even though God had to punish them, God still loved His people. God still loved them. And this is a message that even today we have a hard time getting sometimes. We have a hard time wrapping our mind around. And that is that a loving, caring God can punish. But He's just like a loving, caring parent. If you're a loving, caring parent and your child does something wrong, you're going to punish them. You're going to correct them to try to bring them back. That's what God was trying to do. Then chapter 19, Ezekiel himself raises a lament over the princes of Israel, over the rulers and nobles. He cries out to God because of what's happening, because of what they've had to suffer, because of what has come about in their lives because of their disobedience to God. And then finally in chapter 20 through chapter 24, Ezekiel delivers his last warning of divine wrath prior to Jerusalem's destruction. He delivers that final warning that Jerusalem's going to fall. Jerusalem's going to be wiped out. Jerusalem's not going to be standing. Therefore, change your life and come back to God. And again, the people refuse to listen to Him. In chapter 25 and following, God is told to be also the ruler over all nations. And therefore he takes Ezekiel and delivers prophecies against nations surrounding the chosen people. Now, we're going to see this especially when we get into the minor prophets, is a lot of the minor prophets, some of them, were written not to Jerusalem, not to Judah to change, but to the surrounding people. God's warning the people around them. And this is what Ezekiel does. Ezekiel begins in 25. He prophesies about Ammon, about what's going to happen to them. He prophesies in chapter 25, 8 through 11, about Moab. Then verse 12 through 14 of chapter 25, Edom. He talks about Edom. These are all nations that were on the other side of Jordan from Judah, who, and some of the prophets will say this, forget which prophet it is, they're going to prophesy on their downfall, because what he says these nations did is when the Jews try to run away to get away from Babylon, they would catch the Jews and they would hold them prisoner, and they would either hold them prisoner until Babylon came through, or they would go to carry these prisoners after they caught running away and bring them back to Nebuchadnezzar and say, oh, hey, here's some Jews who ran away. And God's going to tell them, because you didn't give mercy, because you didn't care for these Jews, this is what's going to happen to you. He also prophesies against Philistia, then against Tyre in chapter 26 and 28. Chapter 28, verse 20 through 26, he's going to prophesy against Sidon. And then chapter 29 to 32, he's going to prophesy against Egypt, about Egypt's downfall. Now, what's interesting in all these prophecies, they're very interesting, all these prophecies, but the most interesting one is Tyre. Because God is going to prophesy here through Ezekiel in a predictive prophecy about what's going to happen in the future. that Tyre's going to fall. Then Tyre's going to be laid flat. And he'll even talk about that there's going to be a time where because of their refusal to come to Him, and because of their sinfulness, God's going to lay the city flat. That they're going to that both the city and the island are going to fall. And what's going to happen is that fishermen are going to cast their nets over the city, meaning the city's not going to be more people are going to fish there. And what's interesting about this is some people and historians, they'll look at it and say, oh, well, Nebuchadnezzar doesn't do what Ezekiel says. Yes, that's right. But what Ezekiel prophesies about does eventually happen. Because what happens is Nebuchadnezzar comes to Tyre. Now, Tyre was a very interesting city in that half of Tyre was on land. The other half of Tyre was on an island, a half a mile away from the shore. What happens is Nebuchadnezzar comes in one of his raids as he goes on Jerusalem. I think I forget exactly which one it is, but he comes down into Tyre and he attacks Tyre. And he attacks the old city. Now, what happens is that the people in the old city, they flee. They run to the island. But the system, I forget if it's bridges or exactly how they got to the old island. I don't remember all the history. But they flee to the island. It's half a mile from shore. And they got part of their city out there. The rest of their city is out there. They flee to that island to find protection. And they find that protection. Well, when they run, Nebuchadnezzar doesn't want to go out there and go and chase them that far. He just levels the old city. He levels the city that's on the land. And he continues on his march. Years later, Tyre is attacked again, this time by Alexander the Great. And again, he attacks the city that's on the land. When he attacks the city that's on the land, they run out to the island to get away. This tactic has worked throughout history for Tyre. This is how Tyre survived. But Alexander does something that the people weren't expecting, and something that is a fulfillment of Jeremiah. Alexander takes the old city where those old buildings were that had been destroyed, and he tore them down. And he takes the logs, he takes the wood, the stone and the dirt, and he begins to fill in the gap between the mainland and this island. Nebuchadnezzar didn't do it because he didn't have the patience. He didn't have the time to do this. Alexander takes great time. I think Alexander, if I remember right, I think it's 13 years he takes in his conquest of Tyre. May not take it back. That was Nebuchadnezzar did 13 years. Alexander does this, but Alexander builds a land bridge. He fills in the water, and basically he fixes it where him and his army can march straight across to this island. And what happens is that Tyre has basically stranded themselves. Again, you got an island that you run to. That's great because nobody can get to you. But if they can get to you and they're on the only way out of the island, you're in trouble. And that's what happens to Tyre. Yes, some fled in boats, but there were that many boats. And so Alexander comes in and he levels that city. He destroys that city. And that city was never rebuilt again on that island or in certain parts. And history rings true of what Ezekiel said, because in modern day, there are people who fished the Mediterranean, and guess one of the places they fish? One of the places they fish is the city of Tyre. The city that Jeremiah prophesied that there was going to come a time when it was going to be destroyed and that it was going to be wiped out, and there would be fishermen who would cast their nets over the top of it. And this shows us the predictive side of Ezekiel. And so a lot of people say, oh, well, that's not what he's talking about, because they'll say, oh, well, he prophesied about Babylon. Babylon didn't do this. Yes, Babylon was included in that, but also there was prophecy about Alexander the Great. And people who have a hard time believing the Bible as being predictive, they say, oh, no way he could have done that. But those of us who accept the Bible as Word of God, we say, well, God told him that. God revealed that truth to him. And so Ezekiel just basically said what God told him to say. And so this is very interesting. Again, there's some more of these, but I thought that was an interesting one of Tyre, the history of Tyre, and what Ezekiel said about it come true hundreds of years later. Again, it didn't just happen with Nebuchadnezzar, but also with Alexander the Great in Greece. From there, we go on to the shift in this chapter. The shift from chapter 32, 1 to 32, about the pain, the devastation, to talk about the future glory, the glorious future that is awaiting God's people. And so, following the predicted fall of Jerusalem, Ezekiel is giving a message of hope for the future, hope for the people. And again, this is very important, because think about it. Again, go back to modern day. If I was set up here for 5, 10, 15 years, and I were to preach to you and tell you that Washington, D.C. is fallen, Washington, D.C. is going to be destroyed, it's going to be laid flat, Jackson, Mississippi, our capital, is going to be laid flat, everything's going to be bad, and you say, no, you're wrong, that's not going to happen, I know better than that. But one day that happens, and the thing you were holding on to, the hope you were holding on to, is that your capital city was going to stand and it falls. That's going to destroy you. That's going to destroy your morale. That's what happens to Israel. And so Ezekiel, by God's revelation, is giving messages of hope. Say, okay, yes, this terrible thing has happened. It's happened because of our sins, but there's hope. There's hope. God's not done. And so when we get in chapter 33 and go through chapter 37, you'll see that Ezekiel's giving a series of oracles about the destruction of this holy city, and he looks ahead to the age of the Messiah and the church. He looks ahead to this glorious future when there's going to come a Messiah and a new kingdom. Now, they don't understand exactly what all this is about, but there's prophecies about the coming kingdom. The same prophecies like Ezekiel had, or Jeremiah has had, same prophecies like Isaiah has had, and these other prophets are going to have. There's a prophecy that God's going to come back and God's going to establish his ruler on the throne. He's going to set up his Messiah in this new people, this new covenant. Then we get to chapter 38. Now, what's interesting about chapter 38 through chapter 39, and we don't talk about it a lot here, is that this is a part of Ezekiel where some people take and run with. Chapter 38 through chapter 48, there's various things, various parts of these prophecies. That this is where I talk about people will come up and try to say that, Russia's talked about here. For years, they thought that in chapters 38 and following, there's a description of a great enemy, and they thought it was Russia. And that Russia was going to lead this great war, great world war. That's going to be all the nations of the world are going to be involved, not just part of them. And this is especially a common idea, especially during the Cold War, when America or Russia was at tension. There was thought that this was a prophecy about this. Well, it's not. There's also those prophecies in chapter 40 through 48 that speak of a new Israel. A new Israel with a new temple and new worship. There's new worship in that temple, new priests. And there's some who even today will take this and say, this is proof that the end times, God's going to come back, or for the end time, God's going to come back. He's going to reestablish Jerusalem. He's going to reestablish his people. He's going to set all these things up again. No, those things don't work. Because all the things he talks about here that's going to happen are going to be things that are against New Testament teachings. Because we've already seen Christ came to fulfill the old law. So that fulfills that type of worship. So that's not what Ezekiel is talking about. I think what Ezekiel is talking about in these 10 chapters is he's talking about the coming of the church and symbolically of what it's going to do. He talks in a symbolic way that no other else talks about the church. He talks about it as this new Israel. And in chapters 38 and 39, he's going to talk about this new church going to have strong enemies. And again, I don't think this is necessarily a specific prophecy in that he's referring to one or two enemies the church has right at this moment. But this is a general. Throughout the history of the church, is going to have enemies. We've seen that. There's going to be problems. There's going to be issues. There's going to be threats from the outside. Then in chapter 40 through 48, there's a description of this new Israel that's going to come. It's going to exist in divine splendor and under heaven's protection. And again, I think this is a description of that new kingdom, a symbolic way of describing what the church is going to be like. That it's going to have this worship, this service to God, that's going to be given to God in a spiritual way, that's going to make God happy, and God's people are going to truly serve and worship Him as He would have them to do. And so here, I believe we end the book of Ezekiel. I appreciate you tuning in for us tonight. Again, if you have any questions, you have any comments, please don't hesitate to let us know. Next week, as I say, we'll get into the book of Daniel. We'll look at Daniel and see what he has to say about it. So we talked about that a few semesters ago. So we're going to take what we did in 13 weeks, so we're going to do it in 1 week. We're going to do an overview. We've done all these other books. I hope, again, you're greatly enjoying these, because this is very important. Because as I said from the beginning in the Old Testament survey, this sets up the foundation. When we understand the Old Testament, And the more we understand, the more we see it, the better we can understand the New Testament. Because that New Testament is, yes, it's new. It removed the old, but it's based upon those same foundations, based upon those same truths that God is the God of all creation, God is God of all things, and God will look after and care for us if we'll look after Him and try to serve Him as He called us to. And again, we can have the same warning Israel had, and that is that we have to be a people who are faithful, who are true and obedient to God, so that He can be able to serve, or we can be able to serve Him and be the people He's called us to be, so we can have redemption. I appreciate again you joining us tonight. We hope that you're finding this study beneficial. We look forward to our last 5 lessons. Hopefully after these lessons are over, we'll be able to be back together in our fall class. But for now, we've got to wait and see what time has there. But for next month or so, we're going to be able to continue these online. So again, we appreciate you being here. We hope that you're having a God-blessed week. Hope you're having a God-blessed time. If you need anything, please don't hesitate to contact us. Don't forget, if you can, to like this video, like it on Facebook, like it on YouTube, subscribe to us on YouTube. That'll help us out greatly with the church. But for now, we appreciate you being here, appreciate you joining us, and we hope to see you again real soon. Thank you.